Things Fall Apart, Chapter 11, page 48. The night was black as charcoal. Azima and her mother sat on a mat after their supper of yam fufu and bitter leaf soup. A palm oil lamp gave out yellowish light. Without it, it would have been impossible to eat. One could not have known where one's mouth was in the darkness of that night. There was an oil lamp in all 4 huts on Aquanco's compound, and each hut, seen from the others, looked like a soft eye of yellow half-light. The world was silent, except for the shrill cry of insects and the sound of Nyawiki's mortar and pestle. As she pounded her fufu, Nyawiki's late cooking was also part of his night. Aquanco had eaten from his wife's dishes and was now reclining with his back against the wall. Low voices, broken now and again by singing, reached Aquanco from his wife's huts, as each woman and her children told folk stories. Ekwefi and her daughter Azima sat on a mat on the floor. Azima was beginning a story when a loud and high-pitched voice broke the silence of the night. It was Cielo, the priestess of Agbala, who was prophesying. Tonight she was addressing her prophecy to Aquanco, and so everyone in his family listened. The folk story stopped. The voice came like a sharp knife cutting through the night. Ekwefi heard Azima's name and jerked her head sharply, like an animal that had sniffed death in the air. Her heart jumped painfully. The priestess had reached Aquanco's compound and was saying again and again that Abala wanted to see his daughter, Azima. Aquanco pleaded with the priestess to come back in the morning. Cielo ignored him and went on shouting that Agbala wanted to see his daughter. Aquanco was still pleading, and the princess screamed, "Beware, Aquanco," she warned. "Does a man speak when a god speaks? Beware!" The priestess walked straight towards Ekwefi's hut, and Aquanco came after her. "Ekwefi," she called, "Agbala greets you. Where is my daughter Azima? Agbala wants to see her." Ekwefi came out, carrying her oil lamp. "Where does Agbala want to see her?" Ekwefi asked. "Where else but in his house in the hills and the caves," replied the priestess. "I will come with you too," Ekwefi said firmly. The priestess cursed, her voice cracking like thunder. "How dare you, woman, to go before the mighty Agbala of your own accord? Beware lest he strike you in his anger. Bring me my daughter." Ekwefi went into the hut and came out with Azima. "Come, my daughter," said the priestess. "I shall carry you on my back." Azima began to cry. She was used to Cielo calling her my daughter, but this was a different Cielo. She was now saw in the yellow half-light. "Don't be afraid," said Ekwefi, stroking her head. They went outside again. The priestess bent down on one knee, and Azima climbed on her back. Cielo began once again to chant greetings to her god. She turned and walked through Aquanco's hut. Azima was crying loudly now, calling on her mother, and the 2 voices disappeared in the darkness. "Why do you stand there, as though Azima had been kidnapped?" asked Aquanco. But Ekwefi did not hear. She stood for a while and then made up her mind. She hurried outside. "Where are you going?" Aquanco asked. "I am following Cielo," she replied, and disappeared in the darkness. The priestess's voice was already growing faint. Ekwefi hurried in the direction of the voice. She picked her way easily on the footpath. She began to run, and she hit her foot against an outcropped root. Terror seized her. It was an ill omen. She ran faster. Cielo's voice was still a long way away. Ekwefi tripped. Then she realized that Cielo's chanting had stopped. Her heart beat violently. Then Cielo's voice came from a few paces ahead. But Ekwefi could not see Cielo. But she heard the chanting and trudged behind, neither getting too near nor keeping too far back. Now that she walked slowly, she had time to think. What would she do when she got to the cave? She would not dare to enter. She would be all alone in that fearful place. She thought of all the terrors of the night, those evil qualities set up free upon the world. The priestess's voice came at longer intervals now. The air was cool and damp. Azima sneezed. "Achoo!" Ekwefi muttered, life to you. And at the same time, the priestess said, life to you, my daughter. And the priestess screamed, somebody is walking behind me. She said, whether you are spirit or man, may Agbala twist your neck until you see your heels. Ekwefi stood rooted to the spot. She stood until Cielo had increased the distance between them. Then Ekwefi began to follow again. It occurred to her that they could not have been headed for the cave. They must be going toward Umwachia, the farthest village in the clan. Ekwefi heard the cries of Cielo. The priestess was now saluting the village of Umwachi. It was unbelievable the distance they had covered. As they emerged into the open village, it became possible to see the vague shapes of trees. Cielo's voice was now rising continuously. Ekwefi had a feeling of openness, and she guessed they must be in the village green. Cielo passed by as Ekwefi quickly moved from her line of retreat, and they began to go back the way they had come. It was a long and weary journey. Ekwefi could now see the figure of the priestess and her burden, and she slowed down. Ekwefi had prayed for the moon to rise, but the half-light was more terrifying than darkness. The world was now peopled with vague, fantastic figures. At one stage, Ekwefi was so afraid she nearly called out to Cielo for human sympathy. Then, Cielo's voice rose again in her possessed chanting. Ekwefi recoiled because there was no humanity there. It was not the same Cielo who sat with her in market. It was the priestess of Agbala, the oracle of the hills and caves. At last they turned and began to head for the caves. From then on, Cielo never ceased in her chanting. She greeted her God in many names, the owner of the future, the God who cut a man down when life was sweetest to him. The moon was now up, and she could see Cielo and Azima clearly. How a woman could carry a child of that size so easily and for so long was a miracle. But Ekwefi was not thinking about that. Cielo was not a woman that night. As soon as the priestess stepped into the ring of the hills, her voice was doubled in strength and thrown back on all sides. It was indeed the shrine of a great god. Ekwefi was beginning to doubt the wisdom of her coming. Nothing would happen to Azima, she thought, and if anything did, could she stop it? Ekwefi would not dare to enter the underground cave. Her coming was quite useless, she thought. And as these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the cave mouth. When the priestess, with Azima on her back, disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hen, Ekwefi broke into a run as though to stop them. As she stood gazing at the darkness that had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes. Ekwefi swore that if she heard Azima cry, she would rush into the cave to defend her against all the gods in the world. She would die with her. Having sworn that oath, Ekwefi sat down and waited. Her fear had vanished. She could hear the priestess's voice. She buried her face in her lap and waited. Ekwefi did not know how long she waited. It must have been a very long time. She heard a noise behind her and turned sharply. A man stood there with a machete in his hand. Ekwefi sprang to her feet. "Don't be foolish," said Akwanko's voice. "I thought you were going into the shrine with Cielo," he mocked. Ekwefi did not answer. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes. She knew her daughter was safe. "Go home and sleep," said Akwanko. "I shall wait." "I shall wait too. It is almost dawn." As they stood there together, Ekwefi's mind went back to the days when they were young. She had married Aneni because Akwanko was too poor then to marry. 2 years after her marriage to Aneni, she could bear it no longer and ran away to Akwanko. It had been early in the morning. The moon was shining. She was going to the stream to fetch water. Akwanko's house was on the way to the stream. She went in and knocked at his door, and he came out. Even in those days, he was not a man of many words. He just carried her inside. Answer questions 1 through 2, 3. Do them all.